With Antioch in Bohemond's hands, at least for the time being, the Crusaders decided to not attack Jerusalem in the summer and postponed the assault on Jerusalem until November. With Antioch and the surrounding area stripped of resources from months of siege, the Crusaders yet again found themselves in need of food. That being the case, the decision was made for the Crusaders to break up into smaller groups to forage for food in different directions. One group, led by Raymond of Toulouse, attacked a Muslim garrison at Murat. This episode is one of the darkest chapters in Crusader history, and has been an unending source of criticism of the Crusades ever since. Being short of food already, the Crusaders were in no mood for a long drawn-out siege. They opted for a more aggressive strategy, with a siege tower attacking one side of the city, and sappers undermining a section of the wall on the other side. This strategy proved to be effective, as it forced the Muslim defenders of Murat to oscillate between the two different fronts of attack. Initially, they chose to focus on the siege tower, but once a portion of the wall collapsed, the Crusaders were inside, and Murat soon fell. However, Murat yielded little plunder, and even less food. It certainly did not have enough food to satisfy the needs of the Crusader army. At the brink of starvation, several Crusaders did the unthinkable, and turned to the corpses of the fallen Muslims for nourishment. Critics of the Crusades have, of course, found unending cause to criticize the actions of the Crusaders at Murat, and the cannibalism perpetrated here has easily become one of the most infamous atrocities of the entire crusading era. Andrew Wheatcroft says of the Crusaders' cannibalism, "This was the behavior of animals and not men. Muslim chroniclers related many acts of treachery and brutality within Islam, but there was something different about the Westerners' rude animal vigor. The qualities that made them so effective in battle also made them capable of any atrocity." Similarly, Stephen O'Shea says, "There, at Murat al-Numan, according to both Christian and Muslim chronicles, the Latin warriors killed all of the townspeople, and then set about roasting and eating them. The slain children, apparently, were a delicacy. Even to medieval eyes, this was an atrocity."
There is no such thing as a spiritual war. When you fight a war, the aim of that war is to defeat your enemy. They involve violence, they involve threats, they involve propaganda, and they involve, let's put it like this, shock and awe. And the eating of human flesh was designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Here we are strong, we are tough, and if necessary, we'll eat you up alive. And to a certain extent, that succeeded. I mean, there was a wave of horror and fear. They eat us, and if they're eating us dead tomorrow, they might eat us alive.
Both Muslim apologists and modern liberals, in their attempts to demonize the Crusaders, have gone as far as to suggest that cannibalism was part of the normal activity of the Crusaders. George Procter, for example, claims that the cannibalism of the Crusaders was not confined to one season of distress, but had become familiar to the rabble of the camp, and reached its height during the Third Famine of Antioch, when, in their desultory attacks upon the Turkish garrisons, they regularly ate the dead bodies of the infidels, and even of their own slain companions. Procter quite simply doesn't know what he's talking about here. The sources that he relies on for cannibalism among the Crusaders at Antioch and beyond are not primary sources, and, in fact, were written for the entertainment of European nobles. Moreover, they include material which makes it clear that they are not of any historical value, at least with respect to the activities of the Crusaders. As Andrew Holt points out, The only surviving sources for claims of cannibalism at Antioch were written several decades after the event and may have been confusing the events at Murat, which took place only months later, with the events at Antioch itself. The Chanson d'Antioch, for example, is perhaps the primary source for claims about cannibalism at Antioch, and it was written around the year 1180, more than 8 decades after the siege of Antioch in 1098. Moreover, it was written for a French audience for the purpose of entertaining knights, and so includes fantastical stories of a battalion of armored Christian women fighting on the battlefield during the First Crusade, and other such claims that are not accepted by Crusade historians. Its account of the cannibalism at Antioch seems equally implausible, describing how some of the Crusaders, the Taffers, roasted the bodies of fallen Turks within view of the city's defenders to terrify them, and when they ran out of battlefield dead, resorted to the local Turkish graveyards for another feast. It is highly unlikely that a source from the era, lay or clerical, would have reported on such a grisly event, or that clerical authorities present on the crusade would have allowed something like this to take place as described. There does exist, however, a letter written by the crusade leadership to the Pope, dated to 1099, that suggests that the Crusaders at Antioch were so hard-pressed and desperate at that point that they considered cannibalism, but only that they considered it. So Procter's claim is a gross exaggeration born out of fantasy with no basis in our best historical evidence. Nevertheless, this episode of the Crusades remains quite macabre. That cannibalism occurred in the aftermath of the siege of Murat is not in question. What is in question regards both the extent and the purpose of the cannibalism. Those who are quick to criticize the Crusades have seized on this event to suggest that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism as an act of bravado or psychological warfare intended to terrify the Muslims. Sarah Grace Heller is a proponent of this idea, suggesting, here, I would emphasize that, for the old French Crusade cycle audiences, cannibalism was one of a variety of fear-inducing acts represented as part of the successes of the First Crusade, acts repeated and amplified in later times when subsequent crusades had failed and were failing. The notion of attacking Muslims, like people fighting over a plate of food, is not strictly figurative, as most Western readers would assume. However, the primary sources tell another story. The primary sources are unanimous that this was an act of desperation, born out of the starvation which the Crusaders were facing. Moreover, the accounts all express shock and dismay at this having happened at all. Our best evidence indicates that extreme hunger, rather than intimidation, is what motivated this admittedly horrific act. The extent of the cannibalism is also less than clear. Steve Weidenkopf, for example, suggests that it was only a small number of Crusaders who participated, saying, most accounts indicate that only a small minority of Crusaders, perhaps a group of landless knights known as Taffers, engaged in cannibalism, and only due to their state of near starvation. The awful event illustrates the extreme situations Crusaders encountered throughout their journey, situations that the vast majority of Crusaders endured without resorting to desperate acts. However, the eyewitness, Fulcher of Chartres, indicates that the practice could have been more widespread than Weidenkopf, saying, I shudder to say that many of our men, terribly tormented by the madness of starvation, cut pieces of flesh from the buttocks of Saracens lying there dead. These pieces they cooked and ate, savagely devouring the flesh while it was insufficiently roasted. In this way, the besiegers were harmed more than the besieged. What exactly many amounts to here is debatable, but Fulcher certainly indicates that the cannibalism was more widespread than even he would care to admit. Still, Fulcher is clear that starvation alone was the sole motivation for those who engaged in it, and the shock of it to him is likewise evident. Human beings have been known to resort to cannibalism under the threat of starvation. Some examples of this from more recent history include the Donner Party of 1846 to 1847, where a group of American pioneers, trapped by heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains while attempting to reach California, ran out of food and resorted to cannibalism to survive. The Andes flight disaster of 1972, where a plane crashed in the remote Andes Mountains, saw survivors stranded for 72 days with almost no provisions, and they resorted to cannibalism to survive. Lastly, there was the so-called Starving Time event in the Jamestown colony from 1609 to 1610, where, during a harsh winter siege by local tribes, the English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, experienced severe famine. Archaeological evidence has since confirmed written accounts that they also resorted to consuming the corpses of fellow colonists to survive. It is also routinely assumed by critics and Muslim apologists that cannibalism, whether motivated by desperation or by psychological warfare, was unique to the Crusaders. Such critics forget that, as I demonstrated in my previous video, there is some evidence to suggest that Muslims also engaged in cannibalism of Christians when they conquered Spain. As Darío Fernández-Morera reminds us, shortly after the Islamic forces landed, the flesh of the cadavers of some Christians killed in battle were boiled in large cauldrons under the sight of terrified Christian prisoners who became convinced that the Muslims were cannibals. And contrary to the primary sources for the Crusades, there is good reason to think that the Muslims who conquered Spain, whether or not they actually engaged in cannibalism, genuinely were engaged in psychological warfare, since this episode did not happen under starvation conditions. Some critics have challenged the idea that the Crusader cannibalism was purely an act of desperation, instead suggesting that the Crusaders actually were engaging in some sort of psychological warfare. Antonio Santosuosso hints at ulterior motives, saying, although cannibalism may have been in part the result of starvation among the Franks, it was also the kind of behavior that spread the utmost fear among the enemy. J. Rubenstein comes right out and says it, writing, spurred by a combination of severe hunger and prophetic rage, some members of the army turned to a now familiar, if horrifying, solution: cannibalism. This time they did so proudly, having learned how to use psychological warfare to their advantage. Amin Maalouf is just as explicit. He asks, did the Western invaders devour the inhabitants of the martyred city simply in order to survive? Their commander said so in an official letter to the Pope the following year, but the explanation seems unconvincing, for the inhabitants of the Marat region witnessed behavior during that sinister winter that could not be accounted for by hunger. Were they cannibals out of necessity or out of fanaticism? It all seems unreal, and yet the evidence is overwhelming, not only in the facts described, but also in the morbid atmosphere it reflects. In this respect, one sentence by the Frankish chronicler Albert of Aix, who took part in the Battle of Marat, remains unequaled in its horror. Not only did our troops not shrink from eating dead Turks and Saracens, they also ate dogs. So why doesn't Maalouf find it convincing that the cannibalism at Marat was solely for the purpose of survival? His only evidence for this is a citation from Albert of Aix, who said that the Crusaders didn't just eat the bodies of the fallen Muslims, but also of dogs. But how exactly is this supposed to count against the thesis that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism due to starvation? That they ate dogs as well is perfectly compatible with, arguably supportive of, the thesis that they did this because they were starving. So while Maalouf finds it unconvincing that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism out of necessity, despite numerous statements from them explicitly saying this, I find it unconvincing that they had ulterior motives simply because Albert of Aix mentioned that they also ate dogs. J. Rubenstein makes a better attempt than Maalouf to render this suggestion plausible, saying, "What we have in these three accounts of Guibert, William, and Chanson is cannibalism, pretended or otherwise, not because of necessity, but as an aspect of psychological warfare. The cannibalism was intended to strike fear in the enemy, and literally to strike at them with Christian teeth." But the key difficulty with Rubenstein's suggestion here lies in the sources upon which he is depending. His suggestion here can only seem plausible by giving priority to later sources from non-eyewitnesses over earlier sources from eyewitnesses who are unanimous that it was starvation that motivated the cannibalism. Giving greater weight to later sources is, generally, bad historical practice. Furthermore, one of the sources upon which his suggestion depends is the Chanson d'Antioch, which, as we have already seen, is known to be an unreliable source. His other sources actually deny that the Crusaders engaged in cannibalism at all, and instead claim that the Crusaders simply made it appear as though they were eating the Muslim corpses so as to terrify the Saracens. While, at a glance, this may seem to support Rubenstein's thesis that the cannibalism was a form of psychological warfare, these sources actually work against him, since they either deny, or at least question, that cannibalism occurred at all. The more weight one gives them, the less weight one can give to the idea that any of the Crusaders were cannibals in the first place. The less weight that one gives to these sources, the less they can depend upon them to justify the idea that the Crusaders cannibalized Muslim corpses as a form of psychological warfare. Most historians of the Crusades have thought that it is best to take the eyewitnesses at their word that the cannibalism was indeed the result of starvation conditions. Rubenstein himself admits this elsewhere, saying, Guibert of Nogent blamed the cannibalism on a band of poor soldiers he called the Taffers. Modern writers have either followed Guibert's lead and accused the Taffers for what went wrong, or they have preferred the testimony of Raymond of Aguilers and the author of Deeds of the Franks, who both placed the cannibalism after the siege had ended and blamed it only on sharp, unexpected hunger. They also were eyewitnesses, and modern historians, like medieval ones, tend to put greater weight on eyewitness testimony. Rubenstein's response to this has been to suggest that the eyewitnesses would have had reasons to lie about the real motivations behind the cannibalism, since, because they were present, they could be implicated. As he says, as eyewitnesses, however, they were also potentially implicated in the cannibalism. It was in their interest to explain it away. Nevertheless, this is an admission that our best evidence for the cannibalism does indeed contradict Rubenstein's hypothesis. Furthermore, Rubenstein ignores how this explanation creates tension with his hypothesis. If the purpose of the cannibalism truly was, as Rubenstein supposes, to terrorize the Muslims, then the Crusaders should have been proclaiming this loudly and proudly, not trying to explain it away. The very fact that, on his own hypothesis, the Crusaders felt the need to try to explain the cannibalism away by recourse to starvation is itself evidence against the idea that it was a form of psychological warfare. For had it been psychological warfare, they would have felt no need whatsoever to explain it away. In conclusion, the best explanation surely seems to be that the eyewitnesses were telling the truth when they said that the cannibalism was solely motivated by starvation. Later sources from non-eyewitnesses, who were clearly embarrassed by these reports, tried to spin things so that the cannibalism never really happened and that it was all just a stunt to scare the Muslims. This is how most contemporary experts of the Crusades judge the evidence, and, despite the ingenuity of Rubenstein's argument, he has not shown that his alternative explanation is superior to the standard one. In sum, then, there is really no compelling argument to justify the idea that cannibalism was an act of terrorism on the part of the Crusaders. We would do well to take our earliest and most trustworthy sources at face value when they repeatedly insist that the cannibalism was a desperate measure born out of starvation conditions. Obviously, none of this is intended to justify the cannibalism of the Crusaders at Marat, but it is intended to counter the narrative that the Crusaders regularly engaged in cannibalism, or that they did so as an intimidation tactic. Those who engaged in cannibalism did so at the utmost end of need, brought about by prolonged starvation conditions. And though this is not a justification for what they did, it does serve to render it somewhat more understandable. I think Nirmal Das perhaps said it best. War and severe privation dehumanize people. This is the only thing to be understood from the incident of cannibalism at Marat. To read it as indicative of cultural or philosophical positions of the Crusaders is simply a failure to come to grips with the necessary and wretched brutality of war.